goes. 7 days since you've been on street in a leaking boat. As freedom goes. 7 days since you've been gone.
While obviously tapping into the keen enthusiasm for this subject, I also have the sense that they're aspiring to provide information in an objective and a factual way. And it's in that vein that I'd like to share with you some of my perspectives on the context of this question, this Sasquatch phenomenon, in the broader panorama of the human experience, but more specifically within the context of our growing understanding of the framework of human and hominid and hominoid evolution, and the question that is starting to gain some traction in the scientific community and engender some interesting discussion, that of the notion of relic hominoids, populations or species that have persisted into the present and maybe sharing the planet with us. So that's the topic, Sasquatch and other wild men. Now, I'm gratified by a sense of a change in the perception or the presentation of this question of the existence of Sasquatch. You know, it wasn't too long ago that it was kind of a dodgy undertaking to do one of these documentaries, because the standard formula was I would be interviewed, and then unbeknownst to me, some armchair skeptic would be interviewed, and we'd be juxtaposed on the documentary as if we're responding to each other's questions, when really neither of us had any knowledge of the other's responses or the opportunity to react to those. And often the armchair skeptics that they would recruit were inexperienced in this field, had devoted no effort to study it really, but just provide a knee-jerk reaction. If you go online now, of course, there's no one I think would ever turn a page in a dictionary, a paper printed dictionary these days, or very rarely anymore. But the plethora of online dictionaries have definitions of Sasquatch that are very similar to this one. A large, hairy, humanoid creature said to live in wilderness areas of the United States and Canada, said named Bigfoot. I've underlined, I've added emphasis to said that this is a pretty reasonable definition. There's no allusion to mythology or legend or any of those aspects, but still couching it in a tentative manner, because obviously we don't have conclusive proof. And I'm not here to convince you of the existence of this creature. I'm here just to share some information. Why I still, after 15 years engaging in this subject, am still quite intrigued by the prospect and still continue doing it. It's also gratifying, and a BC connection here, another Canadian connection here, it's gratifying to see professionals of acclaim and stature take the subject seriously as well. You may have seen this portrait that was painted by Robert Bateman, a Canadian naturalist and conservationist and a very talented artist. I'm kind of a frustrated avocational artist myself, and I've always admired his wildlife portraiture. You can kind of see here too the inspiration for his perception of Sasquatch. And if you'll indulge me, did I do that? I did. I turned it off, didn't I? There we go. Here's his description of his painting. He says, "The moss-draped branches barely part as a large dark shadow moves swiftly through the forest. It is a vertical shape, over 6 feet tall. Its long legs rule out a bear. It must be a primate, but is it ape or human? Apes do not stride in such a full, easy manner, and humans are not covered from head to toe with shaggy dark hair. There is no such animal in any of the mammal guides, and yet it must exist because there are so many reported sightings. Even allowing for some hoaxes and downright fabrications, there are enough stories which have the ring of truth to convince some distinguished scientists of the possibility of the existence of the huge man-ape creature. Even Jane Goodall and George Schaller have been positive about the possibility. The Salish tribe of southwest British Columbia called the being Sasquatch, meaning hairy man, from which we have coined the name Sasquatch. It is also called Bigfoot, since the footprints are up to 22 inches long, averaging 16 inches and 1/3 wider than human prints of the same length. Most of the sightings come from remote, densely forested areas, seldom visited by humans. Sasquatches are generally shy and move away quickly, although a few frightening incidents have been reported. 2 men in a truck camper on the west side of Harrison Lake, BC, noticed an ape-like face in their window and almost immediately afterward felt their vehicle being shaken as if to overturn it. Uncommonly, there are intimidation displays, breaking branches, running back and forth, throwing stones. These are behaviors similar to those of chimps when they are angry or distressed. Perhaps this rare animal is a descendant of Gigantopithecus, a giant fossil ape of Asia. But until we get some tangible evidence, bones, teeth, hair, that can be submitted to DNA testing, this fascinating mammal will not appear in the field guides. So that's a pretty comprehensive little but succinct summary there by Bateman himself. One of his reviewers, an art critic, said this, which I thought was interesting. Far from detracting from a serious painter's body of work, we believe this painting adds to Bateman's cachet for having the ability to at least ponder the possibility. And that's a good sign that the conversation has turned in that direction. I've also had the privilege of working with another professional. This is Jim Halfpenny here, to my side here. He is a renowned tracker, travels the world teaching courses in animal tracking. And he approached me about the possibility of collaborating on a workshop. So our fledgling weekend workshop took place this couple of months ago up in Gardner, Montana, at the north entrance of Yellowstone, and we spent a couple of days discussing the tracking of rare and elusive animals, from Bigfoot to cougars, wolves, and grizzlies, which are his particular specialty. And that was a very gratifying experience. We'll be doing that again early this spring. There we go. All right. So as we think about this subject of the wild man, the wild man image is almost iconic. Well, it really is iconic, almost an archetype. And some would suggest, some scholars have suggested that it is simply a manifestation of the human psyche, our connection or our sense of connection to the wilderness. Perhaps an echoing of some racial memory of interacting with other pre-human hominids that we may have coexisted with. I would only take exception to the notion that it is universal, because it's not. There's a remarkable correlation, as I hope you'll see as we progress here, with the local ecology. These creatures are wild men of the forest, and they are only reported from areas of dense forest cover and rugged, remote mountainous areas. The green man is another sort of manifestation of this wild man. It sort of grew out of the wild man tradition, but took on a different persona, that of the consort to Mother Nature, if you will. Instead of just simply being covered with hair, it became covered with the verdant greenery of the forest. And it's kind of tempting to wonder if, because in the original depictions, it was much more similar to this, where you have a hairy wild man that appears to be peering out through the green foliage. Eventually the foliage became the covering, even to the point of issuing from the mouth to represent him as the source of the verdant greenery of the forest. You know, could this representation actually hark back to memories of that other wild man peering out of the forest at its hairless cousin, looking after the activities, the sights and sounds and smells of civilized human activity? It's kind of funny if you look at some of the carvings, some of the depictions of the wild men. Some are quite stylized, some are quite fanciful, some are quite realistic looking. This one is on a portal in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and you can see a typical wild man covered with hair, just the hands and feet bare, the very deep face and heavy brow, low forehead, and your typical peasant here alongside. If this sculptor had in front of him a skull of a classic Neanderthal compared with that of a modern human, he couldn't have made a better depiction of the very distinctions of the cranial anatomy that distinguish, that differentiate Neanderthals from modern humans. So it raises the question, could some of this tradition of the wild man that was so steeped in the traditions of medieval Europe have been spawned from our recollection of sharing that continent with a pre-human hominid at some time? Interesting to contemplate. Now, it's important to recognize that in these early traditions, there wasn't a notion of an evolutionary history. Instead, nature was seen as the result of a creative effort, of a perfect creative effort, that created, that represented a scale from the simplest to the most complex, with humans here, as the scriptural passage says, placed just a little lower than the angels in the scale of things. It's this notion of creation, which was also referred to as not only the scale of nature, but the great chain of being, that gave rise to this term, the missing link. You know, we think of it in terms of an evolutionary context, but it originated as a representation of a missing link in that perfect chain of being. If creation is perfect, it's perfect in its completeness. And so we would expect there to be forms that fill the void, the very obvious void between the animal kingdom and humanity. And so, as the discipline of biology, of natural theology at the time, study of the creation in order to understand the creator better, became more and more widespread. And Linnaeus set out to catalog all of nature, all of creation, as his students returned from, and travelers and explorers from remote corners of the globe, came back with stories of strange man-like animals. That was perfectly acceptable. That was to be expected. These were the missing links in the great chain of being. And Linnaeus actually in his Systema Naturae, his catalog of classification, erected a taxon, a nomen, called the anthropomorpha, the man-shaped creatures. And these were some examples. Now it's interesting, as you look at these, you can begin to recognize some of them. For example, this one is an orangutan. Very distinctive, the very exceptionally long digits, the very reduced short palates really gives it away, just the foot itself. Now, I'd add that the walking stick is just an artistic tool to suggest that these animals weren't very adept at walking on their two hind feet, on their bipedally. Not that they actually employed a walking stick. Here we have a chimpanzee. This is a gelada baboon, and they've got the details down to even this little, looks almost like a necklace around her, across her chest there. The geladas have a bare chest, and they have a little string of, or a little sequence of little blistery vesicles, which during estrus become quite tumescent, look like a little glistening crystal necklace across their neck. But you can see the feet, you can see the tail. But notice that anthropomorphic face, you know, kind of some artistic license there. And then there was the troglodyte, another member of the genus Homo. We were Homo sapiens. You know, it wasn't just a sort of a egocentric notion that we're going to call ourselves the wise species, but we were wise compared to Homo troglodytes, the caveman, cave woman in this case, a nocturnal, mute, hair-covered, primitive type of human, type of Homo that was juxtaposed against us. Now, well, just to point out, see the anthropomorphic face given this creature, you know, when many saw this as just a sort of a derogatory depiction of a native woman from Southeast Asia, but perhaps that same artistic license was used to sort of soften the description of a much more primitive looking anthropomorph. Linnaeus was criticized for erecting this category, and here was his response. And I put the whole thing here, if you'll indulge me, because I think it's kind of interesting. Oftentimes amongst the Bigfoot community, there's sometimes heated debates about whether Sasquatch is closer to human or closer to ape. And in reality, a lot of people who take exception to the label of ape don't really understand what apes are and their behaviors and anatomy. And so I had to actually take some solace in Linnaeus' response here. He said, let's not quibble over words. It will be the same to me whatever name we apply. But I seek for you and from the whole world a generic difference between man and simian. The argument here was it was unjustified, his critics felt, for uniting humans with other apes, with other primates. Man and simian, that follows from the principles of natural history. I absolutely know of none. If only someone might tell me a single one. If I would have called a man a simian, or vice versa, I would have brought together all the theologians against me. Perhaps I ought to have, by virtue of the law of the discipline. Maybe he would have been justified by the principles of classification, in other words. So we have this juxtaposition of two types of people on the planet. Now, it never quite got the reception amongst the scientific community. Blumenbach, much later, he was actually credited with the first formal description of chimpanzees and its proper taxonomic nomenclature. He described Homo troglodytes as the great mistake of Linnaeus' effort. And he argued instead that Homo troglodytes was a confused description mixing traits of humans and chimpanzees. This isn't Meldrum's thesis here of a hybrid between humans and apes, but to create a Sasquatch, but just showing a combination of characteristics, rather. Okay, so but Blumenbach was satisfied to accept primates, which replaced anthropomorpha, but there were only three types that he was aware of. Homo sapiens, and then amongst the simia, there was the common chimpanzee, and this is supposed to be an orangutan. It actually looks more like a chimpanzee, not a very good depiction. The gorilla wasn't discovered for quite almost another century. So it wasn't added to that litany of primates for quite some time. Now, the notion of Homo troglodytes was resurrected in the context of Sasquatch, a connection with Sasquatch or Wildman, by Boris Porzhnev, who was a Russian scientist, not a biologist though, not even an anthropologist really, but he did manage to get his manuscript published in Current Anthropology, and it evoked quite an interesting set of responses. Current Anthropology has the formula: when a paper is published, it's followed by commentary from a number of scholars, invited commentary, that are formally reviewed and published themselves. And so, unfortunately, the paper, while it broached a real interesting topic, this notion of relic hominoids, he did it rather clumsily, unfortunately, and so it never really got the attention or the acceptance that might have advanced us quite a bit. Okay, so that's the point. So we went from a context of special creation, the notion that all these species were individually and separately placed here, and that the wild man was just another type of creature that must have been created for some reason. We went from that to we're getting into an evolutionary perspective where things have a relationship by descent. But in the early writings, journalistic writings of European colonists or residents of North America with wild men, they had no context. They had very little idea about the known great apes, and they certainly had no idea about primitive human ancestors. And so all they brought with them from Europe was this notion of the wild man. So when you see newspaper accounts from this time period, they're described as the wild man of the woods. Now this one, it appeared in the Adams Sentinel in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but it's describing an event that took place in Arkansas. And let me advance one more time. Here's the critical paragraph in describing this encounter, and it's remarkably familiar sounding. He was of gigantic stature, the body being covered with hair, and the head with long locks that fairly enveloped his neck and shoulders. The wild man, after looking at them deliberately for a short time, turned and ran away with great speed, leaping from 12 to 14 feet at a time. His footprints measured 13 inches each. Now that could be transposed into the present and sound very similar to a lot of descriptions of encounters. That deliberate watching, that interest is kind of like the wild man peering, or the green man peering out through the foliage, interest in human activities. Secretive. Now, as those settlers of North America began to push further westward, here along the Columbia River, you know, we're right there on the old Oregon Trail, as I am here over in Pocatello. During about 1846 to 1869 was the peak of the migration across the plains and through the mountains to the west coast. So think about that time period. We're still in pretty much a pre-Darwinian time. The notion of hominid ancestors and so forth, it hasn't taken a hold. These people are bringing with them ideas that are rooted in that European tradition of the wild man. You can imagine as they approached the mountains, I'm sure there was a lot of intrigue and trepidation as they faced that obstacle rising out of the plains. But their minds were probably filled with the various types of threats and dangers that are more common to these areas. There really wasn't the need or the room, you would think, for a wild man, for a boogeyman to enliven their evenings or their trek there through the tall grass. I tell you, after the one time I had a rattlesnake slither between my feet in tall grass, I made sure on the rest of the trip I never stepped anywhere that I couldn't see the ground very clearly. But yet there were stories, there were some traditions of wild men that already were probably reaching their ears. The artist Paul Kane, and Chris made mention of this individual in one of his panels. When he was, got a little ahead there, when he was investigating Mount St. Helens, just north of here, the volcano, the Indians asserted that this area was inhabited by a race of beings of a different species who were cannibals, and whom they hold in great dread, called skookums, or evil genii. And also reference to this account. This is one of the earliest accounts we have, and it took place very close to my neighborhood on the Idaho-Montana border sometime in the mid-1800s, presumably. A grizzled trapper related this account to Teddy Roosevelt, who was sufficiently intrigued by it to include it in his volume titled The Wilderness Trapper. And of course the indigenous populations had their own oral traditions and artistic representations of those traditions. This is a potlatch up on the west coast of British Columbia, and you can see amongst all the various characters depicted with these fanciful and stylized masks, standing out quite starkly here is the Bukwas, the wild man of the woods, with a very stereotypical depiction: the heavy brows, the shock hair, the sunken eyes, the man-like face, the flaring nostrils, oftentimes depicted with a grimacing smile, evenly worn teeth, no projecting canines. It's another distinctive characteristic. And the female version of this is the Tsonokwa, often are stereotypically depicted with lips pursed, indicating the high-pitched whistling call, hands outstretched, which she would often cover with pine pitch, so she could snatch up wayward children more readily, throw them into her basket, take them home for dinner. Not as her guests, but as the main course. Now, if you would like to share a video clip here that was made by the First Nations in Canada. You find it there? You just run the cursor down right about here. And that start of pain should start. No, not there. Right there. There, you got it.
I have a legend of Jonathan which goes, it was told to me by one of my elders, is that when children were bad, they would always tell the children that the Jonathan was coming to get them. And the Jonathan within dances, we see many dances where a Jonathan danced with a basket on their back. And she would go down to the village and pick up the children and throw them in the basket. She'll bring them off to the mountain, and if they're bad, she'll eat them. And the Junipah is the wild woman of the woods, and we need the food for children. So this was one of the stories always told to the children, so that they would behave.
Using her hands to scoop up the kids. She'd often have a very crude wicker basket on her back. But she was quite dim-witted, and she was prone to doze off. And because the basket was so crude, the kids would take advantage of that opportunity to pick a hole in the bottom and slip away and make their escape good. Because of concern over the potential loss of these traditions, that the First Nations have cooperated with various agencies to document, to film these dances, and in this case with the Aboriginal Tourism Association of BC. All right, now this was interesting. In Wyoming, this notion is quite widespread. This notion of the boogeyman role of Sasquatch and stealing children. And in Wyoming, I work frequently with John Lyanzinski, who's a wildlife consultant. And on this occasion, we had the companionship of Fred Chapman, who was one of the state archaeologists in Wyoming. And we were up investigating this pictograph, that's on the side of this canyon. This canyon is quite interesting. It's a feeder canyon on the east side of the Wind River Range, and up at the head is a ranch, and then beyond is public land that it's kind of difficult to get to because of the ranch right there at that choke point in the canyon. There was a house just down here a ways, right there. The gentleman had a nice little garden and enclosed with a picket fence to keep the animals out. But something was getting in and routinely stealing his vegetables. He was getting very frustrated by this, so he sat in the waiting, in the ready, with a shotgun in his lap, and he heard a bump or something, noise outside. He swung the door open, and to confront whatever animal, whatever varmint was stealing his carrots, and up stands a Sasquatch with his hands full of vegetables. Fortunately, the gentleman emptied both barrels, knocked the Sasquatch through the picket fence. It jumped up and ran away, but it had obviously been wounded. The deputy sheriff came and investigated, gathered up all of the blood evidence on the fence slats, and took them with him. John got word of this and went to investigate. Just within the very next day, was informed that the deputy had taken this evidence and went to find the deputy, and the deputy had thrown it all in the incinerator.
Oh,
Because not a conspiracy, but it's this attitude that they didn't want the embarrassment of a story, a claim about the shooting of a Sasquatch, and they didn't want the place to be overrun with reporters and quote, Bigfoot hunters and so forth. But anyway, the point of this slide is that up on the wall is this picture. Now the whole wall was covered with various pictographs and all different types of scenes. The humans were always depicted as stick figures, literally stick figures, astride horses, standing next to teepees, and so forth. And, just various daily activities. And then there was this one, though, and unfortunately it's quite damaged by the water here. But you can see that it had to be quite thick. Here's the body, the torso, and the foot sticking out to the side. And this thick arm with this big 5-fingered hand and a squared-off shoulder. The head, unfortunately, is pretty much missing here. Well, when I saw that, I immediately remembered having seen this image, which is an archival image of the Sonaquah costume that you just saw, a modern version of, with these very stereotypical hands upraised. And as I started to look a little further then, Fred, he was quite interested because he had found a panel that he couldn't interpret. He called in some elders to come and gave him some refreshments to convince him to spend the afternoon with him. And they hiked up to this panel, came around the corner. They saw these big, broad-shouldered arms upheld with this very distinctive chevron shape across the chest. And they all of a sudden got very quiet. And they started chatting to each other in Shoshone, and they turned to him and said, "You're not supposed to be here.
yeah.
We're not supposed to be here. We've got to leave. This is a sacred place." Well, he finally got them to tell them this was the wild man of the woods, or the wild woman. And then, thumbing through an archive of pictographs attributed to the Anasazi in southern Utah, this one caught my eye. Now, is this just all coincidence that these all have this very, those gigantic hands? I mean, that's what really sets these creatures off as different than a bear standing upright. You see a creature with these human-like hands. Well, it's important that we give due credence to the traditional knowledge of the native populations. I would just add, and do it kind of lightly here because of the nature of the audience, but are these just to be dismissed as boogeyman stories, just so stories to keep wayward children in line? Is it just inconceivable to think that there might be a creature out there that would snatch a child? We learned that in Uganda, at the peak of the droughts that they were suffering there, that there was a rash of similar incidents occurring by chimpanzees. So a behavior that sounds like a just so story may in fact have its roots in a real event. Now in this case, this is interesting. There was a recent article you may have seen where a new species of tapir was recognized in Brazil. A tapir, this is a horse-sized animal that had evaded recognition by science until just recently. Now, granted, we already know about some forms of tapir, but you could say the same thing. We already know about some forms of ape. We're not talking about unicorns here. We're talking about some type of hominoid. But I thought this statement was really apropos. The author of the paper said they did not give previous scientists that had not recognized this, they did not give value to local knowledge and thought the locals were wrong. Knowledge of the local community needs to be taken into account. That's what we did in our study, which culminated in the discovery of a new species to science. So, all right, so we've got these colonists, these pioneers that are forging westward with ideas about the wildland, but they, like I said, they have very little knowledge of really what apes are. Apes have already been described. The first chimpanzee, a juvenile specimen, was examined carefully in 1699, but it was just labeled as a pygmy. The notion of chimpanzee hadn't been explored yet. The skeleton of that specimen is still on exhibit at the Natural History Museum in London. And this was the artist's depiction. You see again the walking stick.
100 years old.
Okay, is particularly interesting because this depiction was on the cover of Bickerstaff's Boston Almanac for 1785. Recently, Brian Regal, in his book about the Sasquatch, showed this depiction. This could be the very first published image in North America of an ape. So by 1785, I mean, at least there was some idea in the Americas of what an ape was, what it might have looked like. Okay, it wasn't until much later, about the time of the westward push by pioneers along the Oregon Trail, that adventurers were first coming into contact with the larger man-like apes. Paul Duchalier, French adventurer, was the first to actually observe gorillas. Didn't observe so much. That was back in the time when you shot first and asked questions later. But this is that famous exhibit in the American Museum of Natural History of the lowland gorilla, which is a specimen that was collected by Duchalier in Africa between 1856 and 1859. Now, 1859, that's the year that Darwin's Origin of Species was published. At that time even, we didn't have really fossil record of human ancestors or human relatives. In 1856, the Neanderthal man had been discovered, but the age, the antiquity, and the significance of the distinctive anatomy really wasn't appreciated. It was thought to be just an odd human skeleton. Likewise, actually 8 years earlier, a skull had been found on the island of Gibraltar, which turned out to be a Neanderthal, but it wasn't recognized as such until 1862. It was just thought to be an odd, misshapen human specimen. But as more and more specimens accumulated, it became clear there was a different type of person, a population, a species. Darwin, when he published an book in 1859, kind of avoided the subject of human origins in the Origin of Species. He knew this was going to be controversial enough. And it wasn't until 1871 that he published The Descent of Man, in which he more explicitly applied the principles of natural selection to human origins and evolution. So at that time, then we had this notion of something that was that had an evolutionary implication. Now, here's another. As we follow those settlers westward, they had other experiences. One of the earliest journalistic accounts, not the first, but an early one, 1902, actually took place just over the hill from my home in Pocatello, near the little hamlet of Chesterfield. And in this case, it's kind of an interesting, there was a group of kids ice skating on the frozen irrigation ditch, and they were greatly excited over the appearance in that vicinity of an 8-foot hair-covered human monster. It was first seen on January 14th. He appeared among a party of young people who were skating on the Port Neuf River. So the creature showed fight and flourished a large club and uttered a series of yells, started to attack the skaters, who managed to reach their wagons and got away in safety. I think if it had wanted to inflict harm, it certainly could have, so I think their escape wasn't that fortuitous. I mean, it was measurement of the track showed the creature's feet to be 16 inches in length, average for Sasquatch track, 7 inches broad. Now, this kind of intimidation behavior is very typical of great apes. Brandishing not a club, but a stick or a piece of vegetation, as we see here in this, you can imagine that might have been pretty close to what those young skaters experienced. Just south of Idaho, in the mountains of northern Nevada, there's a mountain range called the Jawbridge Mountains, and a very deep canyon. The canyon particularly is well known. When the settlers in this area asked the natives, why is it that you live down here in the dusty sagebrush? Why don't you go up in these, because there's beautiful subalpine meadows and thick forest. They hunted up there, but they wouldn't live up there. And they said, oh no, we can't live up there because the Saavits, or the Soavitsa, which was the Shoshone, the northern Shoshone, or southern Shoshone, term for the cannibal man, the cannibal monster, lives in these mountains. In fact, the name Jawbridge is a anglicized version of Soavitch, which is the Shoshone for this creature. So there are traditions all along the Oregon Trail. This one was, now in those mountains, again, the cannibal monsters that lived there. One of my good friends is a member of the Shoshone tribe. He lives on the Fort Hall Reservation just north of Pocatello. He was raised in Nevada though, and he told me that growing up, his elders told stories about children being snatched by the Sasquatch, or by the Soavitsa, different versions of it. He's an artist. His name is Willie Preacher, and this is one of his pieces in which he has depicted this very tradition. So you can see cold, hard winter, they're in their teepees, and here's the footprints of the Sasquatch, the Soavitsa, standing in the margins, waiting for his opportunity to reach underneath that teepee margin and snatch that fast food. Of course, in America, the public awareness of the Bigfoot and Sasquatch really caught hold in 1958 when Jerry Crew returned from his job site there with a plaster cast of one of these giant footprints that had begun to show up around the construction site. They said that every time new earth was moved and turned, fresh tracks would show up. It was as if the Sasquatch was curious about the earth-moving activities. Now, what many people don't realize, you know, that lately there's been several books that were written, and there seems to be this effort to create a consensus that Bigfoot began in 1958. We won't even go into the whole Wallace story about the possibility, the suggestion that these are all fake, made with carved wooden feet. Jerry's two sons still live in Portland, and Cliff was nice enough to introduce me to John, and I was able to spend an afternoon with John when I was in Portland on business, and shared with me the actual original cast from that they got from their father. It was interesting. It's always interesting to hear the story retold from the perspective of the kids that were alive and quite aware of what was going on at the time. Okay, now what many people are unaware of, though, of course, as was mentioned by Chris, is that there was an incident much earlier in Canada that caught the journalistic attention of the folks up there on that side of the border, and a cast was made of one of those footprints left in the deeply impressed in the garden there at the Chapman residence on Ruby Creek but it was made by a deputy sheriff from Washington that had come up to investigate. Unfortunately, it hasn't survived, but a tracing that he made did survive. Okay, and here it is, you can see side by side. Now, what's kind of, I find a bit humorous, another self-professed expert in footprints has written a book called Recasting Bigfoot, and he talks a lot about footprints, but he takes considerable exception to what he sees as a misrepresentation. In one of John Green's books, he juxtaposed a tracing of the Bluff Creek footprint with that of the Blue Creek, remarking on their notable similarity to one another. Well, Mr. Quasar here says, well, this is how it should be traced. This isn't anywhere, this isn't what the footprint really looks like, and John is misleading his readers by trying to make these two match. Well, he's just barking up the wrong tree. Here's two examples of footprints from the same individual, not from the same exact instance, but shortly after Jerry Crew had made this cast available to the newsmen there at the Humboldt Times. They sent a reporter up, and he was able to witness some of these footprints, take photographs of prints in the ground, and make a cast of his own. You know, there's the natural type of variation that you find in the configuration of the toe row. The point being that regardless of how accurate or inaccurate this might be as a tracing, this degree of toe, or this degree of toe angle and this degree here can easily be accommodated in a single individual, let alone within a single population. For example, oh, that turned out a little dark. Here are two tracks. These are out on the table. And again, I have to credit Cliff for causing the penny to drop by asking the right question. I'd always kind of looked at these, and I noted that there were some similarities in the size and so forth, but there's quite a difference, it appears, in the angle of the toe row. How could you have that kind of variation? But, you know, as when he asked the question, I looked at it a little more closely again, and it made me kind of evaluate why I had been reluctant. If you simply turn that cast on the right just a little bit, so now the toes line up perfectly, and in fact when you do that, now the edge of the foot, the forefoot, lines up much better with the forefoot here. The only difference between these is the angle of the heel segment. Well, a foot that has a transverse tarsal joint or a mid-tarsal joint allows for twisting of the forefoot relative to the hindfoot. When the foot is twisted in this fashion, you know, some people have looked at this and say, look, it almost looks like it has an arch. Well, it's not quite a human arch, but it is a raised medial edge. This foot is in a position we describe as supination. Now, if you just, even sitting there, if you just turn your knee outward, you'll feel what that does to your foot. When you rotate your knee outward, it supinates your foot. It raises the medial side, and when that occurs, the angle between the forefoot and the hindfoot is angled. There is an angle, it increases. If you turn your knee inward, you'll notice that it forces the inside edge of your foot downward onto the floor. This is called pronation. Sometimes people who suffer from obesity will sometimes have their knees will rotate in and they'll become a little knock-kneed and very pronated. Their arches collapse, and when that happens, the foot, or in that posture, not the pathological condition, in that posture, the forefoot and the hindfoot line up. So here's the same individual, and showing, if we go back to this, clearly the same individual, the difference in the toe row exceeds what Quasar takes exception to. So, no argument there. So what do we see? That the Sasquatch foot is simply an extension of trends that we find in other ape feet. We go from a chimp to a lowland gorilla to a mountain gorilla, larger, more terrestrial. We see some decided trends. The heel gets longer and broader. The big toe gets stouter and less divergent. The lateral digits get shorter. And if we take that just a couple notches further, we see that the Sasquatch has this exceptionally long heel, very, very broad, given its greater mass and weight. Its toe is more aligned with the other toes, and its lateral digits are shortened even further yet. to resist bending stresses. It has retained, though, a very flexible midfoot, which is an innate characteristic, which humans have given up for a rigid arch to create a stable platform. One of the prints that most illustrates the dynamic of that midfoot flexibility was occurred on the Bluff Creek sandbar at the Patterson-Gimlin film site. This photo was taken by Lyle Laverty just a few days afterward, and then it was cast, that same track was cast by Bob Titmus about 10 days later. And you can see this is a pressure ridge. What happens there, and you can see it in motion here, is that as opposed to a human, which has a fixed arch, such that when the heel comes off the ground, the entire foot acts as a rigid lever with the fulcrum here at the ball of the foot. The Sasquatch retains that ape-like flexibility of the midfoot, so the heel comes up in first, while the remainder of the foot remains in contact with the ground. Weight's now concentrated over this part of the foot, which can sometimes push or cause some displacement of the substrate back here, creating a pressure ridge, or this negative space you see. And you can see it right here. Right at that point, just before that final frame, there's a point where the heel segment is absolutely vertical. If that foot had a rigid arch like a human, it would have to be sticking down into the soil about 8 inches. But it's not, it's flexed, it's bent. This shot is also great too, because you can see, when you look at this, they look kind of like little stubby toes, little peas in a pod there, like they'd be very short. In fact, Grover Krantz argued that they had very short toes because of their large size to further reduce the bending stresses on the toes. But in reality, the mid-tarsal break spares the toes the bending stresses because the weight's actually pushing through this entire area, not just through the ball of the foot and the toes. And so the toes are long, so they can be more prehensile. But look here, as that foot swings forward and those toes point towards the sky before the foot plants. Now, a stiff wooden foot would certainly not do that. But that also shows not only animation of the toes, but look at the length. Those are long toes. The toes come all the way back to this crease. This little indentation right there marks a slight crease across this part of the foot. And that's the joint, just like on your hand, that's the joint of the toes, the base of the toes, with some webbing, those knuckles. So the toes are pretty long. Okay. Another one to illustrate this, another aspect of this. Western Washington, Grace Harbor County, Deputy Sheriff Dennis Hereford makes a cast of this remarkable footprint made under ideal conditions. You can see the example out on the table. There were also some half tracks in association where it was running back to the trees, apparently spooked by somebody coming onto the site. The anatomical landmarks are so clear in this that I can see the head and the base of the fifth metatarsal. I can see the bulge right here that marks the joint capsule of the calcaneo-cuboid joint. That marks the transverse tarsal joint, or the midfoot, the axis of midfoot flexion. And so when the heel is flexed up and just the forefoot is impressed, then look, lo and behold, it terminates right there at the transverse tarsal joint. Now, what's also really remarkable about this is look at the superimposition here. The half track has expanded out beyond the margins of the full-length track, because when it's running, landing on just the front half of the foot, the weight, the pressure per unit area on that foot is increased, and that causes the sole pad to expand, displace laterally even further. Again, I mean, the anatomical detail, I don't know, can you hear the excitement? I just, this is to the point where for someone to just suggest that these were all made by a family of the Wallaces carving wooden feet and tromping around the Pacific Northwest is just so ludicrous that it's laughable that people still suggest that. And here's another example. I had this out, someone made off with this particular, the full-length one, but the half track is still out there. I cast these outside of Walla Walla in 1996. Again, the half track, the proportionality is agrees with that of other tracks that show this feature, and you can see too that it doesn't just terminate randomly, but there is this angle, this very same. Let me pop back here. I shouldn't go backwards, but if you look right here, notice the slight angle. This ridge doesn't run just straight across. It angles from more proximal on the medial side of the foot to a little more distal on the lateral side of the foot. That's because, as you can see here, it's going back this direction because the calcaneal, or the talonavicular joint sits a little bit further forward, and so the point of pivoting or rotation is a little bit further back here, and so it shows up here in that fashion. I draw that attention to that here because for another reason here. Here's another nail in the argument here, or another brick, I guess, in a better way than the foundation, sorry. It's better than, you don't want to nail it in the coffin. China has stories of wild men. The Chinese word yeren simply means that, wild men. And here's one artist's depiction, a Chinese artist's depiction of what that wild woman looks like. Kind of an experience very similar to what Bob Gimlin had here. I had the privilege of going over there. We met with a witness who was a park ranger who had a sighting. Very interesting sighting. Saw it at some distance, but very clear, unobstructed view in daylight. It's laying on top of this big boulder, sunning itself. He thought it was an odd-colored bear. He yelled at it. It sat up and turned and looked at him. And no snout, no ears on top. Slid off the boulder and walked away on two legs. So he hustled after it, tried to track it, found where it stopped at a spring. And in the muddy bank of the spring, it squatted down, flexing its foot. They wouldn't let me look at the casts until they had the cameras rolling because they wanted to capture my initial reaction. And so as we're driving off to the site where we were going to have the interview, I gave him a reprint of one of my papers, and it had that illustration with the three views of the track from the Patterson-Gimlin film site showing the pressure ridge. He saw that picture. He couldn't read the English, but he saw that picture. Got really excited. Grabs my jacket and starts thumping and pointing to this picture. I said, okay, well, when he unveils them, here they were. Here you can see it better. It's a little hard because of the lighting was a little diffused. It was a cloudy day. Couldn't get some strong shadows. But you, like here you can see it really well. Here's that furrow. But even notice the anatomy. This bulge here is formed by the tuberosity of the navicular. I mean, we can correlate the anatomy. There it is, that same shape, that kind of heart shape right there. There's the tuberosity of the navicular, and the ridge running off at a slight angle so that it's a little more distal on the lateral side. This guy had no clue about Sasquatch. He asked me, is there anything like the yeren in the United States through an interpreter? I said, well, as a matter of fact, I think there is. The fact that this footprint so remarkably reflects the anatomy of the mid-tarsal break is just absolutely convincing to me. So, what's the connection? Is it the same species? Well, it's interesting. I've collected a lot of different evidence and anecdotes of footprints, particularly footprints, not just the stories, from all over Asia, obviously. And I've had the chance to go to China. I've had the chance to go to the Caucasus and meet with some of the Russians. I got to New Delhi only to have civil unrest break out in one of the provinces here, and I arrived in the dark and had to board a plane to leave in the next morning before the sun came up. My wife was in tears. She said, "You were all the way to India." She said, "I've got a whole list of things. You just stay there for another week on your own time." She said, "The Taj Mahal is only 30 minutes away by train." I said, "Honey, I'm not going anywhere by myself." We pulled up at the hotel, and they brought the mirrors out to go underneath the car, and it had a double gate. That was after we came through the first gate, and they looked and checked for bombs, and then we went through this second gate, and then they x-rayed all my luggage before I could go in the lobby of the hotel. And it was the hotel was surrounded by a 10-foot fence with razor wire all the way around. So I'm not going anywhere by myself. But anyway, I was on an airplane on another time, and I opened up the magazine, and there was an article about the imperiled status of the Asiatic tiger. And they had a map similar to this one. It wasn't this particular one, but similar to this. Here's the distribution of tigers in the lighter orange as of 1900. By 1990, the habitat has been reduced to these fragments. Now, the tiger requires wet forests. It needs proximity to water. They're pretty adaptable. Some of them also exploit grasslands and so forth. They still need to have places to den, places that they can find cover, and lots of water. And what's interesting is, what struck me was these were the same places I was getting evidence in the form of footprints of a Sasquatch-like creature, which also needs heavy cover, forests, lots of water. So whether it's up here in the Pamir Mountains, or the peaks in Tajikistan, or here in China, or in Vietnam, or Malaysia, or the Mande Barung in India, or the foothills of the Himalayas, not the Yeti of the high Himalayas, but in the foothills they have. This was a track that was found by Josh Gates. This was a fascinating one from the Caucasus. A 17-inch track that looks just like a Sasquatch track. We went back on my last trip to Russia. We were able to get the mate to it and interview the witnesses that had seen it, seen this long line of tracks in mud and snow. So, not the great chain of being, but looking at evolutionary, now we have a different sort of missing link. And the number of missing links has continued to grow. When we, early on, all they could do was compare us to our nearest living neighbor, which was the chimpanzee. A lot of difference there, obviously, but when you consider all the extinct missing links in this chain, it's remarkable the number of intermediates that actually exist. Australopithecus afarensis looks like a chimpanzee with long legs. Now it's funny, when one of the experts who examined the Patterson-Gimlin film said, it's inconceivable that such a chimera would exist in nature. From the waist up, it looks like a gorilla. From the waist down, it looks like a human. Such a combination would never occur in nature. This was in 1967, 68. Well, in the 70s, Australopithecus afarensis was discovered. And guess what? From the waist up, it looks like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, it looks like a human. Inconceivable that such a combination would ever exist in nature. Until you discover it. There you go. So the tree has grown tremendously. Now, two sides to a thematic coin here to bear in mind as we place this whole thing now into context. As the fossil record of human evolution continues to grow, one of the things that's very evident is that at any slice of time, there were multiple species of hominids alive on the landscape. And this isn't even showing the hominoids, the apes, which the fossil record for which is growing and growing and growing as well, too. But just look at the hominids. So if you went back in time, if you had a time machine, let's say we went back just 20,000 years ago into Eastern Asia, you might run into Homo floresiensis, this little hobbit. You would find specimens of Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. If you went a little further, now you don't have to go too far back to the west, you'd run into Homo neanderthalensis, Homo denisova. This one here hasn't been formally identified yet, but a population that the authors suggest is a distinct population, perhaps worthy of species designation, the red deer hominids. Likewise, Gigantopithecus for a long time had the distinction of being the only fossil form other than chimps, gorillas, and orangs that had survived well into the Pleistocene. But then teeth that had previously been attributed to Homo erectus, found alongside Gigantopithecus, are now being attributed to Lufenpithecus, which was a gorilla-sized ape. So at least one more contemporary, and that list is probably going to grow of apes that persisted way up into the Pleistocene. Okay? So lots of diversity, lots of contemporaneity, lots of lineages that have persisted well up to the present, such that one really has to ask, as the title of this book suggests, are we really the only hominid species? This one suggests we are. How we came to be the only humans on Earth. Lone survivors. And this is the theme. It was funny. the Learning Channel, TLC, I think it was TLC, or maybe it was No Life, had a series called Becoming Human. And they were exploring this theme of contemporaneity of species in the past. And then the final episode was called The Last Hominid Standing. And what did they argue? They said, well, why would we be the last one? Well, it's our intelligence, it's our tool, our culture, our tools and technology, and so forth, and our dominance over the environment. Well, back when Homo erectus was thought to be the last of a linear evolution leading to us, it was argued that they were different than the earlier Australopithecines, for which we knew there were multiple species, because they were just bipedal chimps. But here we have Homo, and because of its intelligence and technology, it was the only one. It was the last surviving hominid that persisted to the present in our current form. As soon as they had that well established in the textbooks, then it was found that Australopithecines were right alongside, and that Homo habilis was persisting right alongside Homo erectus. There were at least 6 species, perhaps, contemporaneous at that time. And so what was called the single species hypothesis was kicked out. But now that argument's been shoved to the present. Well, why would now be an exception to the rule that had prevailed for 7 million years? Especially in view of the fact that there are so many other reports of potential relic hominoids. Now, some people are starting to think about that, the fallacy of that argument. Recently, New Scientist had a feature series of articles which the cover story listed as Human Evolution, the 10 biggest questions. And question number 9, are other hominins alive today? Now, they kind of didn't give it quite the positive treatment I would have hoped. But there are all these reports on these various comments of different types of other potential relic hominoids, whether it's Sasquatch, whether it's the European wild man, the Yeti, the Yeren, the Orang Pendek, or the Ndutu, or the Mande Barung of India. And so that's why I've launched this journal called the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, which you can look up online. And it is a refereed online journal, peer-reviewed, with articles, reviews, commentaries that provides a venue for discussion of these topics. Okay, I think we'll stop there.